Welcome back to Mr. Excalibur. My name is Arthur. Today we're looking at the Practical Plus XL Lite. Now that's kind of a mouthful when it comes to these practical series from Hanwei. They have a number of these prefixes and suffixes that kind of indicate the difference between these blades, these swords, and the standard kind of base model Hanwei practical katana put out by Hanwei. The practical series really was kind of revolutionary as far as the Chinese-made katana style sword market, in that essentially they almost invented this price point. They invented the whole idea of a good sword that was affordable. It had some nice aesthetics to it, and in addition, and this was the big part, especially when they first came out in the late 90s, early 2000s, was that they were affordable. They were affordable. Essentially what Hanwei had done is they had created what we now refer to as the entry-level sword. Something that was functional, something that could stand up, especially to the rigors of someone who didn't necessarily know what they were doing, and we're going to make a number of mistakes along the way. But to boot, it was also something that was affordable. For those of you who may remember a little bit of sword history here, back in the late 90s, katanas were kind of a rare thing as far as something that was good and was what was affordable. Essentially, you had two categories. You had one, which were stainless steel pieces of junk. Now those pieces of junk sometimes ran between $200, $300, even $400 because they would dress them up with all kinds of really nice furniture. For those of you who remember the Noble collection, they used to sell take or tachi style katanas that had fancy wooden scabbards, and they had all this stuff, but it was still just a stainless steel blade. And then you had that, and then everything else was custom made in small shops that were at least upwards in the range of thousands of dollars, and there was nothing in between. And what there was very, very hard to find, even in the early days of the internet when things were actually getting out there pretty fast. So when Hanwei came out with the original practical katana, that was a big deal. So for those of you wondering, well, what about this one? I have to say, this sword was a big surprise. By now, you've probably seen a number of videos that I've done on Hanwei. This is kind of a series that I've been doing, and for the most part, I've been kind of oh-hum about Hanwei. Some of them I thought were alright, and some of them I just didn't like at all. Of the ones that you guys have seen already, the two that I only really liked was the Shinogi Sakuri Hanwei from their Raptor series, and then the Great Wave katana, which is a little higher end as far as the price range of what I'm looking at goes. But even at that, both of those swords had the kind of very typical, or what's become the typical, almost axe handle-ish feel to them. This one did not. Just so you guys know the kind of the terminology here, the practical series comes in a number of variations. Let's take a look at it really quick here before we get to some of our normal footage. So this is the Practical Plus XL Lite. Now, what do all those terms mean? Well, the Practical series, of course, is Hanwei's practical, their performance series blades. These are ones that are really meant for the early practitioner, and to have something that also has a decent look to it as far as aesthetics are concerned. And like I said before, Hanwei really, practically created this whole range of swords from the ground up. But this one in particular is just so you guys can understand what all the different suffixes and affixes and appendixes and plus XL, elite, and all that kind of stuff, what it all means. Well, I'm just going to focus on this one in particular. Again, the Practical series, of course, is what we just talked about. The Practical Plus refers to a couple things. First of all, this sword has a real temper line, a real hamon line. This sword has been differentially tempered. Second, it has a little bit nicer of a finish on it, even though it still has kind of a practical finish on it. If you look up close at this, it still has that kind of rough finish to it, but it's a step up. That's the idea. The other thing is that all the fittings are a little bit nicer. It's a step up is what the plus means. The samurai wrap, from what I understand, is real. They include a few nice manuki here on the handle, and the fittings, the fushi and kushira, are just a little bit nicer. They've got just a little bit more detail. So, I mean, it's just a little bit step up. So that's what the plus means in Practical Plus. Now, XL. What does the XL mean? XL, extra large, extra long, whatever. What it really means in this case is that they've taken the blade and they've made it a little bit wider. This is what would be considered almost a high-performance blade. I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But what they've done is they've significantly widened out the blade, given this pretty stout cutting blade, and it did not disappoint, as you guys will see. And so that's what the XL means. The XL means a larger blade, and I'm not dealing necessarily in length, because the length of the Practical series all tend to stay around the same. But what it really means is the width of this blade, how wide this blade is. That's where the XL. And then the light at the end of the Practical Plus XL light has to do with this here, of course, and that is the fuller, otherwise known as the bohi. I'm actually going to talk about that separately too. So for those of you who are fanboys who are talking, is a bohi really a historical, aspect of a katana? The answer is yes, and we're going to get to it here in just a minute. But before we do, we've got all kind of the standard stuff. So first of all, let's take a look at the unboxing footage, give you an idea of how this got to me, and then some cutting footage. This was really fun. And then, of course, the stats, and then a nice wrap-up here at the end. So here we go, right now. So what I decided to do this time was to simply just take some stills as we look at the unboxing of this Hanwei sword. As you guys are seeing here, this is the outer box. Inside, you've got some popcorn filling. Inside that is the box that the sword actually comes in. Now, the reason why I tend to show this is because this sword came from Cult of Athena. It's one of the distributors that I often get these from, mainly because they're one of the only ones that have as good of a deal as they usually do, plus how well they ship these. Now, the box that the Hanwei product actually comes in now has these I kind of think it's kind of funny where it said the contents of this package are very sharp. They actually have to say that. I've gotten lots of Hanwei products before, and it's the first time, well, it's not the first time, but just in the last couple times I've got this, they've started to put that, almost like a Surgeon General's warning you put on a pack of cigarettes. Now here's kind of a nice little video clip I did of the innards of, to see how well this is shipped. You have these two foam blocks, actually three foam blocks, kind of at the ends in the middle of the sword, just kind of making sure it doesn't bounce around too much. Then it's, in a plastic bag. Inside you've got the sword bag itself. Per this being, one of the lower end models, or, it's from their Practical line. It's a very simple nylon bag. When I took it out, the Sageo cord, which is fairly simple, it may not even be something that you'd actually want to use. It's more decoration than anything else. I replaced it with a much heavier one. But it had one, and it wasn't even tied in a gift knot. I'm finding that actually happen with a lot of the very practical kind of budget line swords that are coming out of Hanwei. They don't even bother with the gift knot, and quite honestly, I don't mind it so much.
I usually end up, tying it around the saya anyway. But here's some nice up-close looks at the handle, the tsuka with the fittings all around. Of course, they've got a dozen tags on it showing you where it came from and where it, who made it and what you should and shouldn't do with it and all that kind of stuff. One of the nice, interesting things about this sword was the finish, the polish on the blade. I wasn't exactly sure what it was going to look like, but what I would say is it's kind of a cross between something that is highly polished with a temper line on it, and kind of cross that and almost kind of a hybrid look with what you have when you get some of the more utilitarian swords. And what I mean by that are things like Cold Steel Warrior, Ronin Katana's Dojo Pro series, the Raptor series from Hanwei. Those, they don't have any particular polish. They don't have a temper line. This one does. This one actually does have a temper line to it. So it was an interesting piece right out of the box. Not as heavy as I thought it would be. Has this nice, really broad blade to it. So some really nice impressions right out of the box. Hanwei very clearly states that the purpose of this sword is to do both heavy, medium, and light cutting. Probably because of how wide the blade is. The blade really kind of lends itself to that kind of heavy cutter look, even though it doesn't feel like that. The bohea on the sword really did do its job. It really did lighten it up. It does have a little bit of saya rattle. In fact, it actually had quite a bit of saya rattle. But then again, at this price range, at this level, I tend to find just about all Hanwei's swords to have saya rattle. And the reason for that is quite simple. These swords are mass-produced. Let's just call it what it is. They are mass-produced, and to make sure that the sayas aren't too tight or too bound, the last thing you want to do is when you're resheathing a katana into a sai, you don't want it jamming into the end or having it carve another channel inside, because that literally is what it's doing. It's chipping into it. So what Hanwei tends to do with all of their sais is they tend to carve the channels for the sword to be kind of a one-size-fits-all. They tend to be very, very, very wide. As a result, you get saya rattle. The upside is you don't have to worry about it being too tight. Too tight, you really can't fix, unfortunately. Some companies will say, well, you can always make adjustments to the saya. The interesting thing is when you're dealing with a solid wood saya, you can't really do that. So it's actually better to have it loose and be able to put some, bamboo or some very thin wood shims in to tighten it up. Then it be too tight, you put the thing in and it literally splits open. That definitely can happen. So just getting the feeling of the sword here, it really did feel very nice. For being such a wide blade, it was very nicely balanced. One of the interesting things about Hanwei's swords is that they often have these very flat handles. And the handles tend to be almost too angular. And the result is that, quite honestly, from I guess you could say a subjective point of view, is I don't like them. This one, that was not the case. The handle still was rather angular. It was slightly oblong shaped, so had a bit of an hourglass, so it was nice, and I was getting some really good cuts off of this. Now that's one of those thicker juice bottles, and I got a nice static cut off of it. Cut it right in half, leaving the bottom there. Now you'll see a couple of these where I do this, and I get the first half too, so nice headshot, so bang, yeah. And what I didn't include here is where I take a second shot and the bottom goes flying. Once cut in half, those heavier plastic bottles, they simply are too heavy. But the nice thing about the milk bottles is you really can't, it really is kind of a poor man's tamashigiri. And the nice thing about it is it's that thin plastic to where you're not really doing that much damage to the sword, and you're really getting some nice cuts in it. And because they're gallon jugs, I mean, you can get 3, 4, 5 cuts out of these things. And yeah, I was really starting to... Another cut. And I was like, do I want to press my luck? No. So, I was really happy with how this was cutting, both some of the harder targets and the bottles. And I just went to town here and came out thinking pretty good. That last one left a static ring just kind of floating at the top, and I was like, ooh, okay, that's good, especially considering it was almost down to the base. So, and one last good, heavy juice bottle here. They really are kind of in my opinion, a little better test of how sharp these swords can be when you're able to make a nice clean cut. See now how the bottom kind of flicked off there? Yeah, that's what happened with all the other ones too. So I tried the static test with the empty milk bottle. Now, there is some criticism of this particular model, in that is it could be a little sharper. And I did find that despite this thing's heft, it didn't, give a nice cleave through the empty milk bottle. So it wasn't perfect, but then again, this is a sword for under $400, and you're getting all these really nice features of this nice broad blade. Now, what I did with the cardboard here was pretty difficult. It actually bent over backwards, and when I move the camera around here, you'll see how folded up this cardboard is. And see, that stuff's been sitting in the sun and it's been baking, and it plowed through it. Now, a little thing about cardboard can be a little harsh on the blades, and more times than not, it does scratch them up. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're looking at doing this in the future. This is a little trick I picked up from Backyard Samurai. Whee! It's a little one of those gift wrapping tubes, and didn't have it real secure, but yeah, the top end went flying. So that was a new thing I decided to do. But you know what? Regardless of what the thing's made out of, these practical line series are made out of 1566. Steel. This is a proprietary material that Hanwei has for their practical line entry-level swords. It still is a high carbon steel. It has to be, and as a result, you gotta clean off your swords, especially if you're doing bottle shigiri where you got liquids all over the place. I will admit one problem, and that is I never take these things apart, and I probably should. But do this and you're pretty sure that you're at least going to have it to play with the next time.
In the video today, we front-loaded a lot of what I wanted to talk about at the very beginning of the video, because this is a little different. As you guys have seen in some of my videos, I haven't necessarily been a big fan of Hanwei, but I have to say, after going through the cutting and handling this thing, I gotta admit, this is my favorite Hanwei to date. Now, I haven't looked at some of the much higher priced Hanweis, but so far, as far as the 500-ish and below range, this has got to be my favorite. And I'll tell you why. It just has a really nice feel. The width of the blade really does some nice cutting, as you guys saw. I really enjoyed how it felt. Everything, of course, came all nice and tightly fitted. Typical Hanwei stuff. But when it came to its performance, it really didn't disappoint. Now, it wasn't quite as sharp as I've seen, especially some of the Raptor series. But you know what? With this slightly wider blade, I don't think it really made much of a difference. Now, speaking of that, so two things about this blade and about the Bohe. Number one, this blade I found to be almost kind of like a hybrid between what's often referred to as a high-performance cutter and a heavy cutter. Now, heavy cutters are things like Ronin Katana's Dojo Pro series, or Munetoshi's Koken sword, or Cold Steel's Warrior Katana, or of course, the ones that everybody always points to when they think about these are the Raptor series from Hanwei. Those are what are called heavy cutters. This isn't quite that because it doesn't have quite the thickness of the steel here that those do. But what it does have is it has a similar grind, even though it does have an actual real temper line here. But it has that really kind of stout feeling to it when using it, and its design is designed to be pretty heavy. And even if you look at it on Hanwei's site, they say heavy to light cutting. And then you kind of temper that with the fact that it is a very wide blade. As I mentioned before, that's the XL in this sword's description. However, when you look at how thick the blade is, it's a little on the thinner side. Now, we're not talking quite as thin as swords like, if you've seen videos on Munetoshi's high-performance cutter or on Skydro swords. I did a video on Skydro. You guys saw how that kind of turned out. That is definitely a high-performance cutter where you have a very wide blade, but the thickness of the steel is rather narrow. And that's so when you push this thing through material, it's got this wide blade to really kind of plow through. However, the durability of that blade, because of how thin it is, isn't that great. So primarily it's made for tatami mat cutting. But that isn't the case here. Here you've got a little bit of a thicker blade, but a wider blade, and so it's good for some of the heavy cutting that you saw us do. And then also this thing probably would be very, very good for tatami mat cutting too. It may need to be sharpened just a little bit. I found it pretty serviceable, as you guys saw, so it may be alright for tatami mat cutting. I would say this is actually a pretty good sword overall, as far as something to get somebody who's looking for something that's going to be good for tatami mat cutting. It has some nice aesthetics to it. Now, I know I've said that before about previous swords. I'd say Hanwei, though, is about the best in this price point, all around kind of general use sword, especially for this price. This is, 400 and below that you're looking at when we look at the Practical Plus XL Lite. Now, another feature that this sword has, and this of course spurs on another big conversation, and that is a Bohe. Now, I have done some research as to whether or not they actually exist. No, I have not found any pictures of historical examples. However, I have found documentation that in fact Bohes are historical. However, Bohes, like a lot of things, were a style. They were a fad. There was a period of time in Japanese history where the katana got a little bit broader, kind of like this one. It got a little longer, not quite like this one, but they were meant to be a little bit of a heavier sword in combat. Well, some people around that time decided that they wanted to take that design, and rather than change the actual dimensions of the blade, in other words, how wide it is, how thick it was, along the blade was, rather than change any of those dimensions, they simply decided to remove this material along the back, lightening up that design. So from a design point of view, from an engineering point of view, it made a lot of sense. You still had the length, the width, and the thickness of the blade, but now it was a little bit lighter and a little bit more manageable, especially by foot soldiers. So for those of you wondering, were bogies in fact historical? The answer is yes, they were. But it was also a style that ended up fading out after this period was over. For those of you wondering what that was, you can ask some comments down below and I'll give you an answer. So the short answer is yes, bogies were historical. So at the end of the day, oh, and one last thing, this is made out of a nice 1566 steel. Now this is a proprietary material that Hanwei has especially for their practical series. And it is again a reason why I would call this kind of a hybrid sword, in that the 1566 material is kind of a compromise between a 1060-ish high carbon steel and a 5160. In other words, they've got some elements that they have added into this alloy, into this steel, to give it a little bit more endurance, more than your average regular 10 series high carbon steel. And so it's got a nice amount of durability to it, a little bit more than just the standard 10 series or 1060 high carbon steel. So that's just a little bit more about 1066 if you guys were wondering. Again, that's a proprietary material that only Hanwei uses, especially in this their whole practical line. Guys, this thing has been a lot of fun. I would definitely recommend this for anybody who's looking at a sword, especially in this price range. This is one definitely to look at. I understand some people may find the width of the blade a little off-putting, but it is worth it. It is a nice feeling katana. The aesthetics are, typical of the practical series, only just a little bit of a step up. It has this nice temporal line, which really looks good. The grind on it is fairly basic, but definitely one to look at. I hope this has been informational. I always want to say informational. Why am I saying informational? Informative. Blah, blah, blah. Too early in the morning. Hope this has been informative for you. And, of course, subscribe to the channel. Comment down below. Always like hearing from you guys. See you guys next time. Bye for now.